Hello, I'm Emma Belsky. From 2021 to 2022, while I was a student at Mount St. Mary's University, I interviewed several professors about texts that they loved teaching and reading. I'm happy to share these recordings with you now as the Grade 8 podcast. Enjoy!
Welcome back to the Grade 8 podcast. This is Emma Weinheimer, and I'm here with Dr. Josh Hochschild. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. John Hersey, a professor of philosophy at Mount St. Mary's, about Plato's Republic. So, hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hello, Emma. Thanks for having us.
Dr. Hersey, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your areas of expertise before we get started?
Sure. So I'm Dr. John Hersey and assistant professor here at the Mount in the philosophy department. And the areas that I specialize in are ancient philosophy and phenomenology with a little bit of hermeneutics. So those are my core areas that I focus on.
Sounds like Greek to me. You want to explain what those are? These are the last two are a little bit.
Sure. So I suppose the ancient philosophy, and particularly with Plato and Aristotle, that's a kind of historical name that we give there. So phenomenology may be the more unusual one that we get. So phenomenology from the Greek word phenomenon, right, that we get carried over into English, is about the appearances of things. So it's basically the disclosedness of beings. So how is it that being is disclosed to us? And we can think about this in terms of experience is probably the best way to kind of come at things there.
Okay.
And then hermeneutics is about interpretation. So usually you hear the word hermeneutics in terms of like biblical interpretation, but in philosophy it has this broader sense of interpreting texts and understanding things and even works of art and other things like that. So those are the areas that I find quite fascinating.
Interesting. All right, so before we start talking about the content of the Republic, can you tell us a little bit about the context, maybe a little bit about Plato and Socrates and just everything, not everything, but a little bit surrounding the text?
Sure, absolutely. So Plato was the most famous student of Socrates. So the time period we're talking about is Socrates dies in 399 BC in Athens. So Plato is his most famous student, and he writes several what are normally termed dialogues, most of which have to do with Socrates in particular. So we learn a lot about Socrates by means of Plato, but in terms of the context of the writing that we get, there are some interesting considerations. So first of all, Socrates himself never wrote anything. So we don't have any texts from Socrates because there weren't any. We do have several extant texts from Plato, which are about Socrates. But one of the big interpretive questions comes up in terms of how much of what we read from Plato is really the historical Socrates and how much is Plato the artist and the author here. So the traditional kind of account is that Plato undergoes a sort of development, that his earliest dialogues are much more Socratic in nature, that they much more capture the historical Socrates. So you get lots of dialogues in this area that are questions like what is courage or what is piety, things like that. And as Socrates goes through and examines these, they inevitably end up inconclusively with no sort of answer. But people have been shown regularly that what they thought they knew, they don't really know. So these are the kind of early sort of Socratic dialogues that we have. And then the scholarship points to a middle period where it starts to become, well, Plato is interjecting more of his own thought here, using Socrates as a character in his dialogues. And then by the late period, we get what's thought to be more of Plato's developed, mature thinking. And he's kind of left off the sort of Socratic framework, at least in terms of the historical Socrates. So as readers, we always have this question, where does the historical Socrates end and the author Plato begin? And it's quite a puzzle for interpreters about how we understand this. We get some clues from other writers like Aristotle and so on, but something we need to keep in mind as we go through reading Platonic dialogues.
Okay. So whereabout in that scale does the Republic fall? More towards the later writing?
So Republic is actually located in the middle period as a kind of in-between sort of transitional text.
Okay.
Although there's some scholarly question about this. And In some instances, scholars think that book one, if you take book one on its own, it does end inconclusively in a way that mirrors some of the other early Socratic dialogues. So some scholars have made the case that book one was on its own a kind of dialogue that ends inconclusively in this way, and that the rest of the Republic, the other 9 books, because it's 10 books long, quite a lengthy dialogue we have here, is a later edition.
Okay. Dr. Hochschild, anything you want to add to this?
Sometimes when students ask me about that question, because it always comes up in teaching Plato, you're right, I invite them to think that you don't have to choose between, is he describing Socrates or is he giving his own views? He might be artistically reimagining Socrates for his own purposes, but in a way that he believes is the best way to preserve a Socratic legacy, right? And even something, I think the Apology would typically be considered closer to the so-called early rather than late. But even that, it's not like it's a transcript of a trial. It's a work of art that is probably based on something about what it wouldn't have been unrecognizable to people who knew how the trial actually went. But it's also Plato's take on it. Yeah, I think it's an inevitable question, but it's also something that might just distract, especially first-time students, from just sort of appreciating, like, let's see what's there in the text. And even the ones that are supposedly inconclusive, as you mentioned, they have some progress to them. It's not as if they're all negative. There is encouragement and artful depiction of things that are worth continuing contemplation. So.
Yeah, even those inconclusive dialogues, we learn a great deal by going through this process that Socrates lays out before us. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of that you don't need to choose between a sort of, this idea of a sort of historical accuracy or something like that and the art of Plato, because as you mentioned with the Apology, textually, Plato mentions twice that he was present personally at the trial.
Right.
So, again, we wouldn't think that this is a verbatim, word-by-word transcript of what occurred here. No one really thinks that that's the case. But in terms of the spirit of capturing what Socrates was about as a person and how he represents philosophically what Plato was expressing, absolutely.
You mentioned biblical hermeneutics earlier in your introduction, but sometimes Bible scholars get bogged down in, like, which gospel was written first or who influenced what, or is this really what happened, or is this some artist? And, those can be interesting questions, especially for, very technical scholarship and research into the language and the history of the manuscripts. But at the end of the day, most of the people who want to read the Bible aren't necessarily helped by that conversation.
Right, yeah.
And what they care about is that this is a text, just take the 4 Gospels, that these are four depictions of the life of Jesus, and they're meant to be as authentic as they could be, but that nobody thinks that they're court transcripts or bits of journalism. They're something else.
Yeah, and these historical kind of developing the chronological account of how the dialogues are written, I mean, they fall under the category of philology, of love of texts, not philosophy, love of wisdom.
Oh, that's a great distinction.
So it's really secondary in that regard.
Awesome. All right, well then let's get into the content of the text. So you said it's 10 books long. Why don't you give us an overview-ish? If there's any particular books you'd like to highlight, definitely bring those up. So yeah, let's go. Both of you are very knowledgeable about the Republic, so let's have a conversation about this.
All right, that sounds very good. So we can start with, I guess, the obvious, which is the Republic is about justice. So that is the ostensible theme of the Republic. And one thing that we can think about is that the Greek understanding of justice here is probably a bit broader than what we understand by justice in terms of assessment of people's actions and appropriate rewards and penalties and things like that. So we can think of it more broadly as a kind of moral issue, ethical, right? That's what we're concerned with here. But one of the really interesting things about the Republic is that in the course of considering what justice is all about, and it does run through all 10 of the books, this account of what justice really entails, we get all of these other aspects, psychology, like how the human soul is configured, and what are the kind of aspects of human nature that are really important there. We get metaphysical questions about being and beyond being and things like that. We get, of course, these ethical issues and epistemological issues, and epistemology is just the fancy word for theory of knowledge. So one of the great things about the Republic is that you really get to, by reading along with Plato here, you get to do so much of philosophy and all of its different aspects, that they all really come together and give you this sort of holistic account, which I think is really the key to understanding the dialogue as a whole. So it is about justice here. So that's the account. So one of the things that I like to draw attention to is that at the very opening, and the interesting thing about Plato is he's not your typical philosophical author, that we have these dialogues as opposed to a kind of treatise or a sort of lecture about, here are my philosophical views and objections and so on. So we do have these dialogues where things are framed. There's setting, there's characters, there's all these interesting aspects that play into what occurs in a Platonic dialogue. So one of the things I do like to emphasize is that at the beginning of the dialogue, it just starts with a very ordinary conversation, a kind of Thanksgiving table question that you might have, where Socrates is asking Cephalus, who is the head of the household where he is dining here, what old age is like, because Socrates is presumably a bit old at this point, but Cephalus, he says, looks quite old to him. So we just ask quite simply, what is old age like? What can you tell us about it? So I do like to emphasize that despite the sort of high-mindedness we might associate with philosophy, this is very ordinary personal concerns with human life that the dialogue starts with here.
How important is it for Plato that he wrote dialogues?
Yeah,
because there's a frustration that I sometimes run into where students want Plato just to get to the bottom line. Tell me, why didn't you write a treatise? Like, why are you making me work so hard to, They sometimes, I think, feel like they have to strip away all those details. Like, I don't care about Cephalus being old. Like, just tell me what justice is. Did Plato was Plato lazy or sloppy, or did he have a plan here?
Sure. So yeah, as you say, I encountered the same kind of criticisms, right? You hear commonly, these philosophers, they have way too much time on their hands. I could have said what Plato says in the Republic in about 2 pages or something like that. But for me, I do think that there is a real kind of purpose and art to Plato's account of using dialogues. It's, on the one hand, something very personal and kind of you drawing your audience in a way that may not occur with a kind of treatise, a sort of profession of one's views. That there is a kind of development that people undergo that happens in the course of a conversation, that there's something sort of organic that sort of draws the characters who speak with one another along with each other, and also the reader along with them. So I see a kind of progression there, and ultimately I think it's for pedagogical reasons, so for teaching, in order to teach people. We see at many points in the dialogue itself where he talks about kind of time for transition, a gradual sort of transformation. And transformations occur like education does. They occur over
Slowly.
time. Yeah, in stages and interactively in this way. And these aren't things that are going to be accomplished all at once with a kind of profession, like here's what the truth is. So those are some of the reasons, although this is quite an intriguing topic itself about why dialogues, why does he write in dialogues? Because that's not very common in the philosophical world.
I mean, well, and if nothing else, you to get to the somewhat bottom line of these, because a lot of these dialogues are, as you say, inconclusive. You need to figure out what it isn't to try to figure out what it is. So I'm sure that having a dialogue rather than a treatise that you could just skip to the end really helps flesh out like what justice is, what piety is, and what all these other things are that Plato's trying to figure out. So if I may ask, so you mentioned that book 1 is very different from the other 9 books. Can you tell us a little bit about book 1?
Sure. So as I had just mentioned, Socrates is brought to a friend's house for a dinner and presumably a festival late at night. And they start him with this conversation about old age. So he had asked Cephalus, who was the head of the household and quite old in Socrates' view, what old age is like. And his friend Cephalus says, old age is not so bad. My other friends who are old think it's quite terrible, and they think that old age is the worst thing ever, and all kinds of abuse are heaped on old people in this way. But he says, I don't think it's so bad. It's really about how you live your life. And this sounds very Socratic to me, right? That this would be right in line with the kind of thing that Socrates is about. It's how you live your life in this way. But Socrates poses to him an interesting objection. And the objection is, well, most people would say that old age isn't so bad for you because you're wealthy. And Cephalus says, again, in I think a pretty sophisticated way, well, there's something to that. You're right. There are many consolations that come with being wealthy that can help out in old age. But again, he holds to his point that he thinks it's really about how you live your life. And that if you live your life in the right sort of way, then wealth, of course, can help, but it's not the core thing. The key is really how you govern yourself, how you live.
Okay.
So that's how the whole conversation really starts out in this way, this question where how does wealth really fit into living a good and a moral life? Because Cephalus made the claim basically that it helps. So Socrates asks him, what's the sort of greatest benefit you get by being wealthy in terms of living a good life? He says, well, you don't have to worry about stealing or taking advantage of others or not repaying one's debts or things like that. So it can help you to live a good, honest, and just life. And then this is Socrates' usual opening, because what he does is he takes what Cephalus says in a kind of ordinary conversational way, and he says, so you're saying that this is how we define justice in terms of speaking the truth and paying one's debts. So that's what really sets things off, and that's Socrates' usual way of proceeding. He finds someone who claims to know something. He asks them to give an account of their supposed knowledge. And then, of course, through
So this is how you define this.
Yeah. And when they try to give this account, they inevitably fail. And the sort of lesson that we find is people don't really know the kind of things that they think they know. And this is Socrates' special brand of wisdom, right? Going in the other dialogues like the Apology, where Socrates discovers that his wisdom is centered around the idea that he's aware of his own ignorance, that he knows that he doesn't know.
Okay.
So that's how book one really starts off and gets set out.
And that's how it ties into the question of justice.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Talk about the characters that finish out book one and pick up that strain of conversation, because
It's like a whole handing of the torch.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to put it. And that's actually quite insightful of you to say that. And the sort of the lure that's laid out there for Socrates. Socrates initially was on his way back to Athens from this festival. And the lure that's thrown out there, stick around. We can have dinner. We can go to a horseback torch relay race, which is kind of interesting that you said that.
Oh.
Because there is an explicit theme of, I call it inheritance, a kind of passing along of things. So that torch image is a really good one. Because what happens is when Socrates first shows up, Cephalus says, it's great to see you, Socrates. If I were younger and still more mobile, I'd come up to Athens to see you. They're outside of the city right now. They're down the port city of Athens called the Piraeus, which is outside of Athens proper. That's where Cephalus lives.
Okay.
And what happens is Cephalus says, I'd come up to see you more if I were able to. And he says something quite unusual. He says that, as I get older and the attractions of bodily or physical pleasures sort of diminish in my old age, I am more interested in conversation, which in a way might sound like kind of a good thing, although it may be a sort of backhanded compliment to Socrates that, now that I can't do all the fun sort of physical things, like, philosophy and conversation sounds really attractive to me. So what happens is as soon as Socrates says, so this is how you would define justice, Cephalus basically leaves. He's had it with
All right,
the
I'm
conversation.
out. I'm out.
Yeah, exactly. So he heads out. And what he does is he hands over the argument to his son, Polemachus. and his son basically inherits the argument. And they actually have a joke about how, oh, I'm going to inherit your wealth, because he's his son, and Cephalus is quite wealthy, so he's going to inherit his fortune when his father does pass on. And they make a joke about inheriting the argument, which Polemachus does go on to do. But I think there's another theme there, an implicit theme about inheritance. So I will frequently ask students about, what else is it that Polemachus inherits from his father in this way? So Polemachus will take over the discussion and say that, yeah, this is what justice is all about. It's speaking the truth and paying one's debts. And Socrates, of course, will examine him in his usual manner, try and make him explain himself, show how the views that Polemachus has, when you tease them out, they lead to things that he doesn't really believe in. And Polemachus finds that he's quite quickly brought to his knees in terms of, yeah, it seems like I can't really articulate, I can't really explain what I mean here in terms of justice.
Dr. Hochschild, do you have anything to add?
No, I want to hear you finish summarizing.
Sure.
book
Okay.
one. That's
Sure.
what I want to hear.
Okay, we didn't actually get to the characters yet,
Well,
other than
there's
what
one
was
more-
the
one
other.
more
There's the
important
son.
character.
Yeah, so we've
Yes.
got the big character coming in who's going to frame the whole rest of the text. So when Polemachus finds that he can't answer Socrates' question, basically, what is justice, in a satisfactory manner and one that is consistent with his own sort of beliefs and views, he gets to that kind of, throw your hands up moment, like, I'm not sure what to say here. And what happens is, rushing into this void was another person at this dinner party by the name of Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus is a sophist by trade, so an itinerant teacher, a wise person. The name sophist is derived from the Greek word for wisdom. And the thing is, he has a strong view of what justice is really all about, where Polemachus was just kind of going off of his own sort of intuitions, which in terms of that theme of inheritance, I think this is what he also inherits from his father, this kind of sort of ordinary view, just follow a couple rules, you can live a good life. It doesn't seem very difficult or hard to him, but when Socrates puts him to the task, he can't really explain himself or justify himself. So I think it's quite interesting that when Polemachus fails here and he gets to that I don't know moment, that Thrasymachus rushes in to fill the void. Because what Thrasymachus has is a strong view about justice that's very cynical and skeptical about what justice is. So Thrasymachus is the one who really, as I said, sets up the remainder of the dialogue. And after some banter back and forth with Socrates, some of which is quite antagonistic and humiliating, Thrasymachus finally agrees to say what his view of justice is. And he explains that it is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. And with a little explanation, Socrates comes back at him a little bit, but with a little explanation, he explains what he means by that. The stronger are those with political strength, the political rulers. And the idea is that justice is basically a rigged game, that the rulers, those in power, make laws that are skewed to their own personal advantage, and they declare what they have proclaimed as what is just and good. So a citizen or subject, depending on the form of government, would naively think that, oh, I need to live a good life and do what I'm told and follow the laws and the rules and so on. But by doing so, they sacrifice their own personal advantage for the advantage of the ruler. So Thrasymachus' view is the smart person will see through this rigged game and will act in a way that is for their own personal advantage. And you have to be smart about it because the rulers do have power. They can imprison you or execute you or otherwise punish you in these forms. So you do have to be intelligent about it. But the idea is that what you want to do is you want to promote your own personal advantage and not to fall into this kind of trap or game of doing the good thing, so to speak, or being just when it's basically things, these laws and rules have been made up in a way to take advantage of you. So that's his very cynical view that he presents there.
And this is all near the end of book one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the key moment in book one. as Socrates is now confronted with how do we address this issue. Because the thing is, Thrasymachus's view, I think it resonates with people in some ways, especially in a modern context. As we look back from our contemporary world, we say, it seems like there might be something compelling about this idea that rulers are generally taking advantage of us and using legislation and this idea of being a good person to take advantage of us as citizens and subjects for their own personal benefit. So it's really quite a powerful argument that Thrasymachus presents here. And what Socrates will do is he'll go to work on him, just like he did with Polemachus. And he has a few counter-arguments that he considers. And ultimately, Thrasymachus is defeated here. But the big problem, and this is what sets up the rest of the Republic, is that the rest of the interlocutors are not really convinced. Thrasymachus gets to a point where he's like, yeah, sure, whatever you say, Socrates, fine, and so on. Just
passive-aggressive, like.
Yeah, absolutely. Just answering, but without a kind of conviction here, that he's basically given up. It's become clear that Thrasymachus really just wanted to beat Socrates in an argument more than uncover the truth of what justice is about. So when Book 1 ends and we don't have a clear account of what justice is all about, the other people at the table, the rest of the interlocutors there, are not really satisfied. So Book 2 starts out with them saying, do you want us to be convinced, really? Or do you want us to just seem to be convinced, to appear to be convinced? Socrates is like, no, I want you to really be convinced. And they say, well, you haven't really done that. So there's that theme of appearance versus reality that runs through the whole of the text here as well.
I really liked how you described the dynamic of the conversation between Socrates and Thrasymachus, and I think there's a sort of general rule of thumb here that's a good working hypothesis for reading any Platonic dialogue, which is that the kind of person that Socrates puts the argument into that person's mouth is a reflection of the ideas that the person is articulating. So you could imagine that Thrasymachus's view that it's really all about power, that justice is the advantage of the stronger, that you should just be out for your own self-interest, that was put in the mouth of a character who is suave and smooth and friendly and made it sound very winsome. And you might even think that Plato kind of stacked the deck by making the view ugly. But there's something intentional there, right? Since it's a view that it's all about competition and you should just be out to exert yourself, he wanted there to be a character who was trying to do that. And what I particularly loved is that Socrates really can't persuade him of the truth because he's not interested in the truth, right? And all that Socrates can do, the most that Socrates can do to Thrasymachus, is beat him at his own game. And there's a great example of Plato giving a kind of extra dramatic detail to a text that doesn't seem to have philosophical significance, but it does. At a certain point, when Thrasymachus knows he's been beaten, he blushes, right? He can't be won over to the truth, and he doesn't even think of Socrates as his friend, but he can be shamed. He can be humiliated and have to leave because he can't, even by his own rules, right? The strongest survive. He loses, and Socrates turns out to be stronger. But then I loved how you described how a different sort of character, who are actually more friendly to Socrates, they realized that Socrates had the better part of the contest, but that he didn't actually
achieve his end goal.
Achieve his goal of persuading of the truth. And I think that's a great example of when you read a dialogue and you see that Socrates is able to sort of win against somebody.
But at the same time, not be let off the hook.
Yeah, and that it's not that Plato is stacking the deck and giving him unworthy opponents, but that he's actually trying to show in an authentic way what would it look like if someone actually lived the way they're describing. And Thrasymachus, to his credit, lives his philosophy. Like there's integrity. He's wrong, but there's integrity to the fact that he's owned up to. He thinks it's all about power. He doesn't even believe that two people can cooperate in friendship because it's always about self-interest. So he's not even going to seek the truth with Socrates. It's a great example, I think, of Plato integrating the drama with the philosophical persuasion.
Yeah, and another big reason why dialogues, writing dialogues.
That's right.
That's not something you can really accomplish by means of a sort of philosophical treatise.
Yeah.
Are there any other books in the Republic that you'd like to highlight? Because we could talk for several hours about each book of the Republic.
Sure, yeah. So that seems a bit too much here. So,
Do you have a favorite part you'd like to teach? Something
I was going to
that
say,
you
like,
love to
what
give?
books do you teach in your Philosophy 103 class?
so usually book one, most of it, not the very end. Book two, and book four. I hesitate a little bit. I have a kind of thematic outline of the Republic, which is strange. Some of the book divisions don't end kind of thematically. Like you can have a conversation like overlap some books. Some books end at appropriate times. So I go by a kind of outline that I've made here. But book four, the account of justice and the tripartite soul. And then the big one is what's normally called the metaphysical interlude at the end of book six, the beginning of book seven, which has the most famous parts of the Republic with the analogy of the sun, the divided line, and of course the allegory of the cave is the big one that we get here, kind of pinnacle moment in the history of philosophy.
Wow,
Do you
that's a
want
lot.
do you want to summarize the cave allegory? Because the Republic is probably Plato's most famous dialogue, and the cave allegory is probably the most famous moment. The dialogue, and maybe even many of our listeners will already be familiar with it, but it's a very, very rich metaphor, and even if people are familiar with it, it might be useful to
Sure.
hear about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what has happened in the meantime, super quickly, was Socrates has tried to explain what justice is and whether the life of justice is better or worse than the life of injustice by developing this account of a city. So that occupies a great deal of those middle books in the dialogue from book two on up through six. So he gives this account of a city, which in his view is a completely good city, and we get some pretty interesting parameters are set up for such a city.
With Philosopher Kings, not biased at all.
Exactly right. So this is one of the big conclusions that we get here, is that in this account, once we go through this whole vision of a city, the question comes up, is it possible? And Socrates says, it's possible, but what's going to happen is you need philosophers in charge. You need the philosopher ruler. So what happens from there is we get into this account of what makes a genuine philosopher most suited to rule. And it has to do with Plato's account of the truth, what he will refer to as the forms. So here we get into the really kind of metaphysical aspect here, well beyond your ordinary life. So with this account, Socrates is trying to explain what is it about the philosopher that puts them in touch with the truth, that makes them most suited to rule in this way. So as he runs through these other elements, he gets to that allegory of the cave. So the key moment that we really get here. So the allegory of the cave, first of all, and I really try to emphasize this to students, is framed in the context of education. The opening lines are, let's compare the effects of education and the lack of education to a situation like this. So it's easy to kind of overlook this kind of frame, but it's really essential to the allegory and to the dialogue as a whole. So what Socrates describes here is a rather unusual situation. He says, imagine a scenario like this, where we have prisoners who are in a cave, and they are all bound in such a way that they can't turn their heads. They can only look straight forward at the wall of the cave in front of them. And on that wall of the cave, there is a play of shadows that constantly moves and appears in front of them. Of course, what happens here is because these prisoners in the cave have been bound in this way and been a prisoner their whole life, and the shadows are the only things they've ever known, been exposed to. They take these shadows to be the real. For them, the shadows are the reality, and they know nothing else. So Glaucon interjects, and he says, these are some very strange prisoners, Socrates, that you
So
describe
Glaucon is
here."
a new character?
Oh, yeah. So Glaucon is, he's the one who basically says in the beginning of book two that, do you want us to really be convinced? Because I don't think you've really convinced us in terms of what justice is and whether the life of injustice is better or worse than the life of justice.
Okay, so Socrates is going back and forth between Glaucon and Thrasymachus.
Yeah, so
Okay.
what happens is Thrasymachus, as Dr. Hochschild points out, once he's been shamed and humiliated and blushes, he kind of,
He's gone for the rest of the
He
dialogue.
disappears.
Oh, he
You don't
is.
see him again after book one.
yeah, he disappears from the dialogue. So what happens is Glaucon and Adeimantus, and they are brothers,
Oh.
take over, and they're the main interlocutors throughout the rest of the dialogue.
And he goes back and forth between those two.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And by the
Anyway.
way, they are the actual historical brothers of Plato. They are Plato's real life brothers, which
Oh,
is
that's cool.
interesting.
That's cool.
So this is telling too that, as Dr. Hochschild said, that it's Plato does a pretty wonderful job at using characterization to further his philosophical account. But these characters are real historical people. So he's not like making up, as you said, kind of stacking the deck. He's not making up names, sort of caricatures of people where you have like Mrs. Malaprop or something like that, where their name like conveys their view. But these are real historical figures. So that's certainly an interesting account of how he uses this historically based characterization, which works really well.
Yeah.
So,
Okay,
yep, go ahead.
Okay, so Glaucon says
Yeah,
these are strange
so
characters.
Glaucon had
I just wanted to
interjected.
clarify, thank you.
No, that's a good point because we hadn't mentioned Glaucon's name. So Glaucon interjects here and says, "These are some very strange prisoners, Socrates." And Socrates says quite tellingly, "They're us. We are the prisoners. We are in this situation of being bound and imprisoned and looking out the wall of the cave." So as Socrates continues, he says, imagine also this, that one of the prisoners is set free from their bonds, and they're able to move around, and they make their way behind them to an upper level in the cave. And as they go up, what they find there is a fire with people holding figures or shapes that are casting the shadows on the wall. And at first this would be very difficult and painful, and they wouldn't be able to see rightly. And they'd kind of long back for the comfort and security of the darkness that they were familiar with. But after some time and some adjustment, they could make things out and see that what they had been seeing their whole life as shadows were not reality, that there was actually this fire and these shapes casting the shadows. So for the first time, the newly freed prisoner sees shadows as shadows, recognizes them for what they are.
Okay.
So you have this moment of enlightenment is probably the best word as he turns towards the fire here. But that's not all. The allegory continues. Socrates says, what if someone forcibly dragged, and there is this theme of strength and force that runs throughout the whole of the Republic. What if this prisoner were now forcibly dragged up the rough, steep ascent, out of the cave altogether into the light of the day? He would be pained and blinded. He wouldn't be able to see anything. It would be difficult. And after some adjustment, after some time, he could start to make things out outside of the cave, in the external, the real world that we have here. And he would be able to navigate his way around there and recognize the things of this world. And ultimately, he may even get a glimpse of and be able to take a glance of the sun, which is providing all this light and making these things seen. And this is a key moment in the allegory, because the idea is that all these aspects of the cave, as we go through these different levels, symbolically represent a kind of movement of enlightenment and, as we said, education. So they all have a symbolic meaning here, and that's why the account is allegorical in this way. So having glimpsed the sun, he is enlightened, and there is this account of a necessity to go back down into the cave amongst fellow prisoners and inform them of this external world and so on. And again, we haven't really talked
what
about
happens when
the
that- 'cause
allegorical
I think often when
significance.
people recount the allegory of the cave, they leave out that second part, right? It's all about emancipation. It's all about freedom. It's all about enlightenment. But so much of the story is what happens when he descends back into the cave.
It absolutely is. And you're right, this is what happens so much. People talk about that elevation of enlightenment out to symbolically what's going to be the realm of the forms, the
Yep.
intelligible
Yep.
realm of truth. But the return back down to the cave, I think, is really integral, and a lot of people do overlook it or leave it out. And there are some different kind of theories about why this is integral in this way, but at least in terms of the progression of the allegory, when the newly enlightened former prisoner goes back down into the darkness of the cave among his former fellow prisoners. Again, just as going from the darkness to the light is disorienting and painful and you need a kind of adjustment, he would not be able to see clearly having gone back down into the cave. So as he presumably tells others of his enlightenment experience, they would, test him and see that he can't make out the shadows very well, and his eyesight has been ruined by going up outside of the cave. And they would be very reluctant to the kind of things that the former prisoner is now telling them, and even to the point where they may even try to kill him is presented here, which I don't think we can help but read as a reference to Socrates himself, who in trying to expose people to the truth was threatened with and ultimately
Right? Yeah.
put to death. So that's the big aspect that we get there. So the movement up and back is really integral to the whole, and that enlightenment is this recognition of, for Plato, what he calls the forms, the intelligible realities that stand behind our sensible world, that's what the truth is really all about. And the sun is the ultimate among these. It's the ultimate form. It's what he calls the idea of the good. And it holds a very, very special place in terms of the forms and everything that kind of follows from it. So what we see is we get this holistic picture. So there are numerous depictions of the allegory of the cave that you can find in books and online and so on, some of which I think are less accurate in terms of their depiction. But one I really like uses a representation of outside of the cave, there's a tree there that is illuminated in the light of the sun. When you go to that middle stage of the cave, in terms of where the fire is, someone is holding up the shape of a tree, and then it's casting a shadow of the tree on the wall, which is the only thing the prisoners have ever seen. And I really like that because it shows the sort of the consonance, the relationship that holds between the intelligible forms, the sensible things of this world, the appearances of those things, and how they're really related to one another. So when the former prisoner makes their way back down to the cave, having understood the truth now, they recognize shadows in a new kind of way, and they see their connection to the ultimate truth of things. And from a political perspective, this makes them especially suited to rule, since they have seen the truth. So they know that truth, and they know how it manifests itself in all of these different ways at each different level.
Okay.
But of course, this is a threat to what people are so familiar with, and that's why they may try to put him to death in this way, and are resistant, they're reluctant to leave what is comfortable and familiar to them.
So how does the allegory of the cave relate to the overarching question of what is justice?
Sure. So
Even if it doesn't answer the question.
So he does, actually. So earlier in the text, finishing his account of the city and the development of the city, he does give an account of what justice is.
This is the part with what was the term you said, tripartite soul?
Yes. So what we find is the initial motivation to explore a city was that he sees a connection between the city on the large scale and the individual on a small scale. So when he gives this account of the city, we end up with three classes in the city, three groups in the city. And these correspond, quite conveniently enough, to the three parts of the soul directly in a one-to-one relationship with each other. So in the city, we have the rulers, and these are the very few what ultimately turn out to be philosophers who know the truth, they guard the city, they are in touch with goodness, and they're the ones who can really govern the whole. The second group are the auxiliaries, and the auxiliaries are the soldiers and enforcers. They really execute the will of the rulers and kind of order the city as a whole. But most of the citizens are in the group of craftsmen, as Plato refers to them, who do their jobs and ply their trades and so on. So they comprise the largest part of the population of the city. And those three parts correspond to elements of the soul: the rational part, or the rationally calculating part in some translations, which is the house of reason; the spirited part, which is an interesting one. That's the part that is responsible for us becoming angry. I like to think of it in terms of like a willpower. So it's spirited, not in the sense of like spiritual, but spirited. I like to give the example of like a wild animal. Like, say you capture a wild horse and you try to tame them and break them, for instance. That's the language that's used. But when they resist you, they're spirited in this way. So it's about a kind of willpower, a sort of inner strength. And then the last part of the soul is the appetitive part, which comes from the word appetite there. So it's desires and so on. So those three parts of the soul are what we have when it comes to the correlation between the city and the soul here. So for the philosopher ruler, he is the one who is in this position to govern the whole. He's the one to basically order the city as a whole in light of the truth, in light of the idea of the good and what is ultimately good in this way. So every aspect of the city has its part. So when he goes through and gives his account of city and soul, his definition of justice is each part doing its own work and not meddling with the other parts. So there is this idea that each part has its own place in the whole of the city, that they do their own work, that they don't interfere, and that they don't meddle with everyone's proper role in the city. And likewise, what happens with the soul is we have the same kind of thing. Now, instead of each class in the city, it's each part of the soul doing its own work. Appetite, for instance.
It does what it does, and you can't control when you get hungry.
And it's important. It's good that we have the desire and appetite to eat and to drink and those things like that. But what happens is, if it meddles, if it goes beyond its kind of proper role and place in the whole, and you become governed by appetite, then what happens is you're
A slave to your own desires.
Exactly, and your life is in disarray.
Part of the function of each is to be related to the other. So hunger should report to you when you need nourishment, but then your sense of pride or your spirited part might let you know not to, pick up the food with your hands and shove it in your face, or to ask permission, or to wait for the meal time, and your reason should tell you, what is the right amount of food to eat and when, and
Exactly.
and all of these things,
You determine with your
hopefully
reason.
you determine with your reason, and maybe most of the time we sort of take for granted that these things are and should be integrated, but when we notice that they can fall apart, and that an intemperate person can eat too much or eat at the wrong times, or that there's not only something intemperate about that, but also something unjust about it. That person is not fulfilling their function.
Yeah, absolutely right. And compromising the whole in this way, right? Because there is this interdependence on the level of the city and in terms of the human being. But as Dr. Hochschild said, there are proper roles that are all subordinated to what is genuinely good. And that's why the philosopher, who has this insight into the forms and the idea of the good as the super special form there, is the one to properly understand this at the level of the city. And of course, the philosophical person, in terms of their soul, are the ones who have this understanding of the good and live a life that is governed by reason in this way, in light of what is good. So that's how it all boils back down to the cave and enlightenment and education and what it means to be educated in this way.
Okay. Dr. Hochschild, when you were talking before, you mentioned the intemperate person. If I remember correctly, there is a point at which Plato compares the different parts of the city and the different parts of the soul to what we know as the virtues, or the cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and which one? Wisdom.
Wisdom.
Wait, prudence and wisdom are the same
sorry.
thing? What am I
Courage.
missing?
Courage.
Did I say courage?
Wisdom or prudence, temperance,
And justice.
Justice is the fourth one. Right?
Yes.
So So that's the strategy in the Republic. We want to find virtue. It sounds very roundabout and exhausting, right? We want to find justice, but we need to find, and we want to find what is justice in the soul. But first we're going to magnify it, find it in the city. But to find it in the city, we're going to have to create a perfect city, and then figure out where the other three virtues are, and justice will be whatever's left over. It's a really roundabout way at getting at justice. So after describing a city that is functioning well, where it's been implicit all along that it's going to be just, but we haven't defined justice yet, he goes through and identifies the four virtues: temperance, courage, wisdom. And that's why he spends so much time, as Dr. Hersey said, describing why you need philosopher kings. It sounds self-interested, but it's almost trivially true. By the time he gets to it, you need rulers who have actual wisdom.
Yes.
And that's just what he means by philosophy. He doesn't mean you're going to pick members of a philosophy department, but
Right.
you're going to pick people who actually have the virtue of wisdom. And then after going through the other three of the cardinal virtues, justice is whatever goodness is left over that we haven't named yet in the city. And lo and behold, it's the fact that we've got all of these things doing their part. It is, I don't know, I think it almost feels like a letdown, but it's also a kind of revelation. Like, could justice be such a simple thing?
Yeah, and it's what I remember is that it's all the parts of the soul working together, all the parts of the city working together, and then you have each of the virtues working in relation with each other.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which you can't really have any one of the virtues without
the other
other
three.
Right? So you can't even have temperance unless you have enough courage to
Be
take a
temperate.
stand against your bad appetites. You can't have temperance unless you have enough wisdom to discern when you should indulge your appetites and how much. So there is a sense in which maybe in fact you can't separate them, but logically we can define them, or we can notice what we're really noticing on this instance is someone is lacking courage or someone is lacking temperance, but it's a sign that there might be other things going wrong.
Dr. Hersey, any thought? Quiet.
No, sure. I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. In terms of this, as you said, kind of strange sort of roundabout way to get to justice. And again, this can frustrate students, the ones who are like, you can't just say what justice is from the start. And I think that's right, that we may initially think it's a kind of letdown, but once we recognize, and that's why the kind of path sort of bringing us to this point and giving us this account of what justice is, and having gone through the other virtues, we see how they mutually imply one another. We see how they really represent a kind of goodness as a whole. And that's ultimately what is best for people. And despite the fact that it may seem sort of self-interested in this way, oh, how convenient for Plato the philosopher to conclude that philosophers need to rule, this is really quite compelling here. And just to add, I suppose, on the way, he's made some very special provisions for those who rule. So the rulers in the auxiliaries are forbidden from any kind of personal wealth or property, which I think is the big game changer in terms of what makes the city as a whole good. And what makes a ruler best equipped to rule when they first decide, like, who should really be ruling here, even before they've given this account of in the Allegory. They determine it's those who recognize that the interest of the city is their own personal interest. So in distinction to Thrasymachus, who basically played his own personal interest off of everyone else's, depending upon whether someone is a ruler or a subject. Here what we have is a harmonizing, we have a fusion of those interests. So to be good for them personally, self-interested in this way, is to be good for the whole. And I think this is ultimately what motivates the prisoner to come back down into the cave with others, is that they do recognize this kind of holistic need that is just. He says explicitly there that it's the just thing for them to come back. We might have to compel them because they'd want to just stay amongst the forms, and they recognize that, being caught in the shadows, imprisoned in the shadows was not a good thing, but they recognize that it is really just and the good thing to go back and do so.
So there's a very common objection that I want to hear you respond to. It sounds like Plato's kind of a totalitarian, or, you mentioned abolishing family and property. he's a communist, or that there's something very, very contrary to the American spirit here of freedom and individual liberty, and the idea that the whole purpose of everything in the city is to serve the good of the whole, and this kind of top-down imposing an order discerned from some abstract pattern in the forms. And, so maybe Plato was brilliant, but he was brilliantly wrong. And actually, if we want justice, we're going to have to do something very different than he described.
Sure, yeah. This is definitely a big criticism that we get there, because Plato, for instance, is not a fan of some of the things that we hold most dear, like democracy and representative government in this way. So what Plato basically settles on is, I think, what we can call an aristocracy. However, we need to understand aristocracy in the kind of proper sense here. So aristocracy in Greek means power or rule, so kratos is power, and the arist, the basis here, means the best. So aristocracy is ruled by the best. Historically, this has been the wealthiest and the noble-born. That's what the best has been. But what Plato has in mind is the best in terms of truth, in terms of goodness. And of course, those who are concerned with truth and goodness are not concerned with property and wealth and even honor and things like that. So he's quite critical of the idea of a sort of democratic government. And this comes up in various forms. Democracy, a similar stem as aristocracy, means rule by the people. Although I get the sense in Greek that there's a kind of negative connotation here, although a lot of this may be due to Plato, in terms of demos, the people being understood as like the mob. They're kind of unruly. They don't really know what the truth is all about. They can be easily swayed and persuaded by...
Appetitive.
What was that?
Appetitive.
Appetitive, sure. Yeah, they're driven by their appetitive desires. So you do get this really interesting thing, which I think is telling in terms of Plato's vision of human nature. His completely good city has rulers and auxiliaries who are forbidden wealth themselves, who are concerned with these kind of higher principles to varying degrees according to their positions and jobs. But the majority of the population is concerned with wealth. They're craftsmen. They ply their trades, they pursue money, they do things in this way, they try to satisfy their appetites. So my thought is that Plato thinks that this is really an insurmountable aspect of human nature, that most people are going to be very naturally driven by their appetites in this way, and that they're not really capable of that kind of higher life of goodness in terms of understanding the intelligible realm, the sort of philosophical life in this way.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.